For most mammals, drinking milk ends in childhood. Humans broke that rule. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors began drinking the milk of animals long after they had stopped nursing from their mothers. It sounds ordinary today, but biologically, it was almost unheard of. Most adults could not digest lactose without consequences. Yet humans kept drinking milk, generation after generation, until something extraordinary happened. Their bodies began to change. A food once available only to infants became a daily source of nutrition for entire civilizations. This is the story of how milk changed human culture, agriculture, and even human DNA. More than 10,000 years ago, milk wasn't something humans drank. It belonged to calves, to goats, to sheep, to newborn mammals. Human adults were never supposed to consume it. That was simply how biology worked. A baby drinks milk because its body produces an enzyme called lactase, which breaks down lactose, the sugar found in milk. As the child grows, lactase production normally decreases. For most mammals, this is exactly what happens. They stop drinking milk, they grow up, and their bodies stop producing large amounts of the enzyme needed to digest it. Our ancestors were no different. For thousands of generations, adult humans almost certainly lost most of their ability to digest lactose after childhood. Then agriculture changed everything. Around 10,000 years ago, humans began domesticating animals in parts of the Middle East. Goats, sheep, later cattle. At first, these animals weren't primarily valuable because of their milk. They provided meat, hides, bones, labor, and eventually something else. A renewable source of food, milk. Unlike an animal that had to be killed to provide meat, a living goat or cow could produce milk again and again. That made milk extraordinarily valuable to early farming communities. But there was a problem. Fresh milk doesn't last very long. Without refrigeration, it spoils quickly. And for adults who couldn't digest lactose efficiently, drinking large quantities could cause bloating, cramps, and diarrhea. So, early farmers began transforming milk. They made yogurt, cheese, butter, fermented milk. These processes changed the chemistry of the liquid. Bacteria consumed some of the lactose. Cheese-making removed much of it along with the whey. Suddenly, dairy products became easier to store and easier for many people to consume. This may have been one of the most important food processing discoveries in human history. A farmer didn't have to drink a bucket of fresh milk before it spoiled. They could turn it into cheese and preserve it for months. Milk had become portable, and that mattered enormously. As pastoral communities spread across Europe and Asia, dairy animals traveled with them. Goats and sheep could survive in environments where crops struggled. Cattle provided milk while also pulling plows. A single animal could provide food, labor, leather, and fertilizer. For early farmers, that was an extraordinary return on investment. But milk's most surprising impact was still thousands of years away, because something was happening inside the people who consumed it. Over generations, natural selection began favoring individuals who could continue producing lactase into adulthood. The genetic mutation responsible for lactase persistence appeared independently in several populations, in parts of Europe, in East Africa, in the Middle East. Different populations reached the same biological solution to the same cultural behavior. Drink milk, and eventually, evolution responds. People who could digest lactose had an advantage in societies where milk was abundant. They could access calories, protein, fat, and water from an animal without killing it. During periods of famine or crop failure, that could mean survival. The result was one of the clearest examples of culture-changing biology. Humans changed their behavior first, then their environment changed, and eventually, their genes followed. But milk didn't transform every population in the same way. Even today, lactase persistence varies dramatically around the world. In Northern Europe, a large majority of adults can digest lactose. In many East Asian populations, adult lactose intolerance remains extremely common. Across parts of Africa and the Middle East, the picture is more complicated, with some pastoral populations showing very high rates of lactase persistence and neighboring populations showing much lower levels. There is no single human response to milk. Our bodies reflect our histories. Where dairy farming became important, evolution often followed. Where it didn't, the old biological pattern remained. And that makes milk unlike almost any other food. Humans didn't simply learn to eat it. In some populations, they changed themselves to keep eating it. But milk's influence went far beyond genetics. As civilizations expanded, dairy animals became deeply connected to wealth, religion, warfare, and survival. Cattle became symbols of status. Herds represented wealth. Milk became part of religious rituals, and control over grazing land could determine whether entire communities survived. The humble animal standing in a field was no longer just livestock. It was an economic system. And as human populations expanded, that system became increasingly important, because the same animals that changed what humans ate were about to change where humans could live. As dairy farming spread, milk became more than a source of nutrition. It became a reason to settle. A herd could move with a community, providing food without requiring fertile fields every year. In grasslands, mountains, and dry regions where growing crops was difficult, animals could turn plants that humans couldn't eat into something humans could. Milk. That ability gave pastoral societies a remarkable advantage. They didn't need wheat fields. They didn't need rice paddies. They needed grass, and grass grew in places where agriculture often struggled. Across the Eurasian steppe, herding communities developed ways of turning animal milk into foods that could survive long journeys. Fermented milk could last longer. Cheese could be dried. Butter could be stored. These foods were dense with calories and nutrients, making them ideal for people who spent much of their lives traveling with their animals. The result was a completely different kind of civilization. Instead of building cities around fields, some societies built their lives around herds, and their animals became central to everything: transportation, trade, food, clothing, social status, religion. In some cultures, cattle weren't simply possessions. They were wealth itself. The more animals a family owned, the more powerful it could become. But dairy farming also changed the landscape. As herding expanded, humans began shaping grasslands to support their animals. They burned vegetation, moved herds between seasonal pastures, protected grazing areas, and created routes connecting distant communities. Milk was helping connect people across enormous territories. Then came one of the most important developments in dairy history: cheese. Nobody knows exactly who invented it. It may have been discovered accidentally when milk was stored inside an animal's stomach used as a container. The natural enzymes inside the stomach could cause milk to separate into solid curds and liquid whey. Suddenly, something remarkable happened. A perishable liquid became a durable food. Cheese could be carried across deserts, stored through winters, transported with armies, traded between distant settlements. It was milk transformed into a form that could survive without refrigeration. Archaeologists have found evidence of ancient cheesemaking dating back thousands of years. By the Bronze Age, dairy production was already widespread across parts of Europe and Asia. Milk had become a technology, not a machine, not a tool, a method of transforming nature into something more useful. And that transformation would become essential as civilizations grew. Ancient Egypt provides one example. Cattle played an important role in Egyptian agriculture and religion. Milk was consumed, processed, and associated with fertility. The goddess Hathor was often depicted as a cow, or as a woman with cow-like symbolism, connecting cattle with motherhood, fertility, and nourishment. The animal that provided milk had become sacred. Across the Mediterranean, dairy products became part of everyday diets. Greeks consumed cheese in large quantities. Roman soldiers carried preserved foods that could survive long military campaigns. Romans also developed sophisticated systems for producing and trading dairy products. But milk itself remained difficult to preserve. Fresh milk was still highly perishable. Cheese and fermented products were much safer for long-distance transport. That limitation would shape dairy culture for thousands of years. Then Europe entered the Middle Ages. Monasteries became important centers of agricultural production. Monks raised cattle and goats. They cultivated land, they produced cheese and butter, and they carefully recorded techniques that could be refined over generations. Many famous European cheese traditions have roots in this period. Dairy production became increasingly specialized. Some regions became known for particular cheeses. Others became famous for butter or cream. Local breeds of cattle were selected for different purposes. Some produced more milk, others were better suited to harsh climates. Still others were raised primarily for meat. Humans were no longer simply domesticating animals. They were actively reshaping them. And the relationship became increasingly sophisticated. By the 18th and 19th centuries, farmers were selectively breeding cattle to produce dramatically larger quantities of milk. The modern dairy cow was beginning to emerge, but there was still a major problem. Milk could kill. Before modern sanitation, fresh milk was easily contaminated by bacteria, tuberculosis, brucellosis, salmonella. Other pathogens could enter the milk during production, storage, or transport. In growing cities where milk traveled long distances from farms to consumers, the risks became even greater. By the 19th century, urban populations were exploding. Millions of people lived in crowded cities. Fresh milk was increasingly important, especially for children, but the systems delivering it were often filthy. Cows were sometimes kept in cramped urban dairies. Feed quality could be poor. Containers were difficult to clean. Milk might be diluted with water, and dangerous bacteria could multiply rapidly. The same food that had helped nourish civilizations was now becoming a public health problem. Something had to change, and the solution would come from a scientist whose name would eventually become associated with one of the most important processes in modern food history, Louis Pasteur. In the 19th century, milk had become essential to growing cities. But the larger the cities became, the harder it was to deliver safe milk to them. Cows lived on farms outside urban centers. Milk had to travel, and without refrigeration, every hour made the problem worse. In some cities, milk was transported in open containers, exposed to dust, insects, and bacteria. By the time it reached consumers, it could be completely different from what had left the farm. And there was another problem. People couldn't see bacteria. They couldn't smell tuberculosis. They couldn't taste salmonella. Contamination was invisible. That made milk particularly dangerous because it looked perfectly normal even when it wasn't. Children were especially vulnerable. In crowded industrial cities, contaminated milk contributed to serious disease and high infant mortality. The problem became so severe that governments began searching for ways to make milk safer. Then, in the 1860s, French scientist Louis Pasteur discovered something revolutionary. Heating certain foods and beverages to specific temperatures for controlled periods could kill dangerous microorganisms while preserving much of the product's quality. The process became known as pasteurization. It was first applied widely to products such as wine and beer. Eventually, it transformed the dairy industry. Milk could now be treated before reaching consumers. A simple application of heat dramatically reduced the risk of many dangerous infections. For the first time, modern cities could consume milk on a massive scale with far greater safety. But pasteurization was only one part of a much larger transformation. Refrigeration changed everything. For thousands of years, humans had struggled to keep milk cold. Now, mechanical refrigeration made it possible to slow bacterial growth during transportation and storage. Milk could travel farther, stay fresh longer, and reach millions of people. The modern dairy industry was born. Glass bottles replaced many unsanitary containers. Railroads connected farms to cities. Cream separators allowed producers to process milk more efficiently. Milking machines reduced manual labor. Refrigerated trucks created national distribution networks. Milk was no longer simply something produced by a farmer for a nearby village. It had become an industrial commodity. And then governments became involved. Milk was so important to public health that many countries introduced regulations governing its production, testing, and distribution. Standards were created for cleanliness, fat content, pasteurization, storage, packaging. The milk sitting inside a modern supermarket refrigerator is the result of all those changes. But there was another revolution happening at the same time. Milk was becoming a symbol of health. In the early 20th century, nutritionists increasingly promoted milk as an essential source of calcium, protein, and other nutrients. Children were encouraged to drink it. Schools began serving it. Governments promoted dairy consumption. Advertising turned milk into a symbol of strength and healthy growth. The message was simple: milk builds strong bodies. And for generations, millions of children grew up hearing some version of that message. Milk became so deeply connected to childhood that many people stopped thinking of it as an animal product at all. It became part of the definition of a healthy diet. But milk was also becoming increasingly industrialized. Dairy farms grew larger. Cows were selectively bred for higher production. Feeding became more scientific. Milking became mechanized, and milk yields increased dramatically. A cow that once produced enough milk primarily to feed her calf could now produce enormous quantities for human consumption. The transformation was extraordinary, but it came with new questions. How much milk can one animal produce? How should cows be fed? How much space should they have? How should farms balance productivity with animal welfare? And what happens when a food system becomes dependent on producing more and more of the same product? These questions would become increasingly important as global dairy consumption expanded. Meanwhile, scientists were learning more about the human body's relationship with milk. And one discovery was particularly surprising. The ability to digest lactose in adulthood was not universal. In fact, most humans around the world remained lactose intolerant to some degree. The genetic adaptation that allowed adults to keep producing lactase was strongly associated with populations that had long histories of dairy farming. In other words, the ability to drink milk wasn't simply cultural, it was evolutionary. Human behavior had altered the environment. The environment created new pressures, and natural selection changed human biology. Few foods provide such a clear example of evolution happening in response to culture. The relationship worked both ways. Humans changed milk, and milk changed humans. But the story wasn't finished. By the second half of the 20th century, milk had become one of the most heavily consumed foods in the world. It was no longer just fresh milk. There was powdered milk, condensed milk, evaporated milk, cheese, yogurt, butter, cream, ice cream. Dairy had become an enormous global industry. Yet just as milk reached its peak, something unexpected happened. People began questioning it. Was milk really necessary for adults? Was dairy consumption equally healthy for everyone? What about people who couldn't digest lactose? What about saturated fat? What about allergies? And what about the environmental cost of producing billions of liters of milk every year? The drink that had once seemed like the perfect food was suddenly at the center of a global debate. And for the first time in thousands of years, humanity began asking a question that would have sounded absurd to our ancestors. Maybe we don't need milk at all. Today, milk is one of the most familiar foods on Earth. It sits in refrigerators across the world. It is poured over cereal, added to coffee, turned into cheese, yogurt, butter, chocolate, and ice cream. For billions of people, dairy is simply part of everyday life. But the modern world has created something ancient humans never had: choice. For most of history, if you lived in a dairy farming society, milk was one of the best sources of nutrition available. Today, people can choose between dozens of alternatives: soy milk, almond milk, oat milk, coconut milk, pea milk, rice milk. The rise of these products isn't just a change in taste. It reflects a much larger conversation about health, animal welfare, sustainability, and what humans should eat. And milk sits directly in the middle of it. One of the biggest questions is surprisingly simple. Do adults actually need to drink milk? The answer is complicated. Milk is rich in protein, calcium, vitamin B12, and other nutrients. For populations that historically depended on dairy, it can be an important part of the diet. But humans are not biologically identical. Some people produce large amounts of lactase throughout adulthood. Others produce very little. For someone with lactose intolerance, drinking a large glass of milk can cause bloating, abdominal pain, or diarrhea. That doesn't mean dairy is inherently unhealthy. It means human bodies adapted differently depending on thousands of years of history. In fact, lactose intolerance is not really the unusual condition. Lactase persistence is. Most adult humans around the world have some degree of difficulty digesting lactose. The remarkable thing is that certain populations evolved the ability to keep doing it. That makes milk one of the clearest examples of recent human evolution. Think about what that means. Humans changed their behavior. They domesticated animals. They began consuming their milk. That created a new nutritional environment. And over thousands of years, natural selection changed the frequency of certain genes. Culture changed biology. Few foods demonstrate this relationship so clearly. But milk's modern story has another side: the environmental cost. Producing milk requires animals. Animals require feed. Feed requires land, water, and energy. Dairy farms also produce methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. As global demand for dairy continues to rise, scientists and farmers are searching for ways to produce milk more efficiently. Better animal nutrition, improved breeding, more efficient farms, better manure management, new technologies designed to reduce emissions. The goal is not necessarily to eliminate dairy. It is to produce more food with less environmental impact. At the same time, alternative milk products have become a massive industry. Some consumers choose them because they are lactose-free. Others choose them because they prefer the taste. Some are motivated by concerns about animal agriculture. Others simply want more variety. But every alternative has trade-offs. Almond farming can require significant amounts of water. Soy production depends heavily on agricultural systems that vary by region. Oat milk requires processing and transportation. No food system is completely free of environmental costs. The question is, which system provides the best balance between nutrition, affordability, sustainability, and human demand? And that debate is still unfolding. What is certain is that milk has already changed humanity in ways that few foods ever have. It changed agriculture by making livestock more valuable. It changed settlement patterns by allowing people to live in environments where crops were difficult to grow. It changed trade by creating products that could survive long journeys. Changed public health through pasteurization and refrigeration. It changed industry through mechanized farming and mass production. And, perhaps most remarkably, it changed the human genome. The next time you pour milk into a glass, it is easy to see nothing unusual. It's white, it's cold, it's familiar. But hidden inside that glass is a story that began thousands of years ago, when a farmer first looked at a domesticated animal and realized that the milk meant for its offspring could also feed an adult human. That decision seemed small. It wasn't. It changed what people ate. It changed where they lived. It changed how they farmed. It changed how they traded. And eventually, it changed their DNA. A food that was originally designed by nature for infants became one of the foundations of human civilization. The ancient farmer could never have imagined modern dairy farms. They couldn't have imagined refrigerated supermarkets, pasteurized milk in plastic containers, cheese factories producing thousands of tons, or plant-based milk competing with dairy in grocery stores around the world. But every one of those developments traces back to the same ancient discovery. Milk could be taken from an animal and turned into human food. For thousands of years, humans have been changing milk. We fermented it, we aged it, we churned it, we heated it, we refrigerated it, we industrialized it, and somewhere along the way, milk changed us too. That may be the strangest part of the entire story. We like to think that humans control the food we eat. But sometimes the relationship goes both ways. We changed the animals changed our diets changed our environment, and our environment changed our genes. All because humans decided that childhood didn't have to be the end of milk. Today, the glass in your refrigerator looks ordinary, but it represents more than 10,000 years of experimentation, adaptation, agriculture, science, and evolution. It is the story of farmers who domesticated animals, of herders who crossed continents, of scientists who discovered invisible organisms, of engineers who learned how to create cold, and of human beings who, in one of the most remarkable examples of evolution in our species, changed their own bodies to keep drinking a food nature never intended for adults. Milk didn't just nourish humans. It became part of who we are. And that is why the next time you see a simple glass of milk, remember, you're not just looking at a drink. You're looking at thousands of years of human history. And, in a very literal sense, you're looking at evolution in a glass.